Which industry gets the award for the most challenging job when it comes to client retention? And how can AI help with client retention in professional services and beyond? And are you ready for a digital CXO that can help you uncover hidden signals in your company's data? Hi, I'm Courtney Baker, and this is AI Knowhow from KnownWell, helping you reimagine your business in the AI era. As always, I'm joined by KnownWell CEO David DeWolf, Chief Strategy Officer Pete Buer, and Chief Product Officer Mohan Rao. We also have a discussion with Matt Dixon of DCM Insights to talk about why loyalty to existing professional service providers is taking a nosedive and how leaders can use AI to stop the bleeding. But first, the news. Pete Buer joins us as always to break down some of the latest AI headlines and how they apply to your business. Hey, Pete, how are you?
Good, Courtney. How are you doing?
Doing good. The World Economic Forum's annual gathering in Davos recently wrapped up, and they published a recap titled Davos 2024, 5 business leaders on adopting AI and managing associated risk. Of these business leaders and their insights, Pete, what stood out to you?
Well, it's hard to talk about the article without talking about the event a little bit first. Just sort of, can you picture it? So like business leaders from around the world all meeting in Switzerland, add a dash of think tank, add a dash of Hollywood. I'm just picturing them showing up in their Aston Martins, getting out with the tux and taking their drinks, their martinis shaken, not stirred, to be a fly on the wall one day. But the article, definitely worth reading when you think just about where it comes from and the kind of thinking that was going on in that session, but also because it tells a good story. The storyline that I liked the most was about business transformation at the hands of AI. And they reference a couple different research sources to provide some data. So here are my 3 data points. 70% of senior executives say generative AI is their number 1 top investment priority and will pay off in the next 3 to 5 years. At the same time, 70% of senior executives, different 70%, different study, say their efforts to set strategy and launch initiatives quickly is being slowed by uncertainty around generative AI. And so the punchline is, at the same time as companies need to be formulating their strategy and driving operations into the space, they need to be thinking really hard about how to bring the people along, raising awareness and managing change. To get confidence levels and trust levels to a better place, and also to anticipate. The article references a bunch of new skills and role profiles that the future will bring, around which there's likely to be sort of next wave of war for talent. So transformation and talent transition, a very big piece of the storyline.
Very interesting. And I think that's probably reflective of a lot of businesses right now, that feeling of these two things kind of opposed at times and trying to walk through those well. So next up, we know you're a stats guy, Pete. We've already established that, which is why I searched long and hard for this post from McKinsey. It's titled Rewired and Running Ahead. Digital and AI leaders are leaving the rest behind. What did you take from this one?
Well, I love McKinsey's leaders versus laggards formula. They've used this in the past to describe other waves, to describe other phenomena in business. And now there's starting to be enough of an evidence base. They scope in digital and AI, but to actually have research to point to deltas between companies that are aggressively using versus the rest of the pack. And the takeaway is that the first movers, the leaders, have a significant advantage over the average. It's at the level, in some cases, of double, triple, or sextuple. Is that the right way to say times 6? In terms of compound annual growth rate of total shareholder return. So that's substantial. A lot of other factors drive shareholder returns, so we're always a little careful when we comment on these kinds of assessments, but the evidence sure looks like it's pointing to a benefit accruing to those who move first and fastest with the right kinds of digital and AI applications. There's also just some interesting additional data about prevalence of the use of digital and AI in sales and other settings, and you're starting to see some places where companies are very, very aggressively using a digital approach to operations like sales and marketing, and you know that there's a cost benefit to that that's hard to replicate with the human. Big takeaway, as we've said many times on the show, time is your enemy. Get moving.
Yeah, that's right. And, you're listening to this podcast, so I'm sure you're actually already doing that. So good on you, everybody listening. Pete, thank you as always.
My pleasure. Love it. Take care.
I love the pay-per-click. It's like my favorite. I need to do it
higher
every time.
so you can actually see it.
As we'll hear from Matt Dixon later in this episode, client retention in professional services is hard. And sad news here, it's getting harder. So I wanted to chat with David DeWolf and Mohan Rao about why that is and what executives can do about it. David, Mohan, welcome to the show. How are you?
Great. Doing well.
Hey, Courtney. Hey, David.
Okay, since we are in the middle of the doldrums of winter, I wanted to be a little provocative here today. And I have a statement for you, and I want to just get your responses to it. I think that client retention is more difficult for professional services than any other industry. Agree, disagree? Am I kicked off the show? What do you think here?
Absolutely no doubt about it. I mean, for so many reasons. So, number one, in a professional services organization, you are reliant on human labor, knowledge, right? People. It's much harder than relying on a product that's pre-built, predefined, that is just going to deliver what it is. In terms of service delivery, right? You're actually reliant on the person itself. And there's also the scale effects of that. It becomes hard to scale it. But more than anything, what I think about when you say that is to manage the relationships of a service provider to client relationship where there are multiple people on both sides versus just a single buyer working with an account manager or just a single person integrating with a piece of software that's the interface, right? We're talking about human beings, and human nuance in relationship is really, really hard. And so I guess the summary is both the service delivery and the relationship with the customer and the brand is reliant on humans. And that makes it infinitely more difficult.
And furthermore, I'll just add to that. In professional services, there are a number of substitutes available, right? There are other professional services companies usually nipping at the heels of the client to say, I can do better, I can do cheaper, I can do this, I can do that. And typically the cost of switching from one professional services company to another is a lot lower than in product companies or in a goods company or where you have long-term contracts or whatever it is. So all of that makes customer retention even more challenging in professional services.
And even just saying that just brought another idea to my mind, which is if you look at the fundamental value proposition of professional services versus, a product. When I'm building a product company, I'm thinking about operating value. How do I make sure I build something that operations are dependent on? So over and over and over again, you want to use my product. When I'm building a services company, it's all about expertise you don't have in-house yet. And so it tends to be transient and go in waves with new technologies or new regulations or new this or new that are being imposed. And so the very nature of professional services by default is project-based, not enduring operational necessity.
All right, so we have awarded the gold medal for the hardest client retention. And we've also already established in a previous episode that professional services is going to be more disrupted than any other industry. So when you take those two things in combination, when we start to talk about what the leadership priorities are for professional services, transformation, or these other topics related to client retention, be thinking about how they apply to your own industry. Because if they're going to work in professional services, most likely they're also going to work in your industry. So, David, Mohan, with the award given, where does AI come into this conversation, and how can it solve the problem that professional services have?
Well, I mean, go back to what I think we've talked about a few times on this podcast, which is, what is AI great at? It's great at finding signal and noise, right? Gobs and gobs and gobs of information and figuring out what's relevant and what we should pay attention to. And it's great at connecting dots, right? Putting different things together that may not seem related, but are, to come up with new conclusions, new inferences, new judgments. Well, I think that is incredibly applicable to what we're talking about, where you have two customers, both of which have multiple employees on each side, likely interacting together. So an infinite number of relationships and communication points that you need to process to make sense out of and to understand your customer. And I think AI is great at that, and will be able to really move the needle in terms of turning what is now very much an opinion of, is a client relationship healthy? Is it solid? Into a true signal of red, yellow, green. Like, what is the status of this customer relationship?
I mean, if you think about how this is done in large consulting companies, they typically have a partner structure, and a partner may be in charge of a dozen, 24 clients at the max, and maybe in charge of, in some cases, about 200 of their employees. So all of the information is really both in terms of what's happening, the predictions inherently that are contained in it, as well as the judgment, are all contained into little pods. While if your billing rates are $400 an hour or $600 an hour, you can afford to build a structure like that. But what if it is not? And if you're a marketing services or a finance as a service company, there is no way to build a structure like that. And that's where a technology like AI is going to come in and help with the concept of CXO that we've been talking about.
I love how you make it specific there. I really agree with that, right? The big consultants have solved this with the pyramid, right? No doubt about it. The examples you use, the other one that comes to my mind is middle market, right? I see a lot of times coming from the professional services space that organizations are able to scale fairly easily to $10, $20 million of revenue. When you get beyond that, when you get beyond 100 million, when you get beyond 200 million, that middle market area is really hard, because you're not really Accenture and big enough to afford all of those, partners working with your enterprise clients. But you're beyond the entrepreneur, the CEO, maybe a couple of individuals in your organization being able to sit in the middle of all of these interactions and pick up all of the data points. And I think AI can help us do that, right?
Yep, no question. I mean, if you can scale human judgment, the only way is to let machines do what they're best at, which is churn out these predictions and then apply human judgment on a case-by-case basis. That's a way to solve the problem. And this problem has not been solved for many centuries, right? So at scale.
Right. Yeah.
So we have a chance at it for the first time.
Yeah, and because it is so subjective and there's human bias that's in it, it gets really, really messy, right? Most middle market professional services firms monitor their customer health based on a spreadsheet or maybe some kludge in Salesforce that they mark red, yellow, green based on some account owner's personal perspective. And there's always people that argue with it. And as a CEO of an organization with 2,500 people, I had no idea how to know if it was the salesperson or the delivery person that really knew. And to your point, it's mind-boggling that this has never been solved. But I think it's never been solved because it is not a compute problem. It is actually an inference problem. It's a judgment problem. And that's what AI allows us to solve for the very first time.
Okay, David Mohan, I know I said we gave away the award to professional services, but I do want to just take a second to talk about how AI might be able to help with client retention in some other industries. What would that look like?
Well, I think it can be applied to customer retention. I actually think this is a great use case of where AI can solve problems that haven't been solved before. And one of the things that all leaders can do is actually look at the genre of problem, right? The problem that is about replicating human gut, replicating human processing of communications, replicating connecting the dots, finding signal and noise, right? This is a really clear example where AI can help, right? And you could take it in all sorts of different areas, right? Not only is customer retention like this, employee relations is like this. How do you engage employees? How do you understand what's going on? Market sentiment, what's going on with your competitors and in pricing is another area where there's not one right or wrong answer. You can't do math, but what you need to do is distill and synergize information that exists out there to turn it into something that's more actionable, right? And to me, that's the great takeaway. Yes, that we can solve customer retention in a way that we've never solved before. And oh, by the way, doing great at customer retention also leads to customer growth opportunities, right? Really understanding your customer in depth. So I think there's a lot of richness there for everybody, regardless of how complex your customer relationships are. You can benefit from this, but I think you can also apply it as an analogy to other areas of your business.
Yep, and within a company, if you want to promote much more of I'll call systems thinking as opposed to point thinking, the continuation of what David said comes into the organization where you should ideally not be thinking about functional silos and think about this systematically across with the client in mind.
I love that. I think as we continue to get more and more AI applications into business, I've continued to be concerned of, how do we actually figure out all these use cases and hear them? And just hearing you talk through some of those is really helpful. Mohan, David, thank you as always. This was great.
Always a pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks.
If you missed last week's episode, I want to invite you to go back and listen to it. It's probably the most important episode we've done. We dive into what KnownWell is building, an intelligent enterprise operating system. So I'd love for you to listen to that. And if you're interested in joining our beta waitlist, I'd love for you to do that right now at knownwell.com. Matt Dixon joined Pete Buer recently to talk about how organizations can use AI and machine learning to elevate their customer and client experience. Matt is the co-author of the Wall Street Journal bestseller, The Challenger Sell, and a founding partner of DCM Insights.
Matt, it's so good to see you. How are you?
Pete, I'm doing well. How are you, my friend?
I'm good, thank you. I'd like to compliment you on your analog background.
Thank you.
Yet another thing we share in common.
Yeah, old school.
Thank you so much for joining the podcast
Absolutely.
today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
And congrats on the business. I was going to say the new business. It's kind of not that new anymore, I guess. And it'd be great if just to set context for folks listening, could you give us the snapshot of DCM Insights and your role?
Yeah. So we are a boutique consulting training firm. We focus on two specific areas. One is B2B sales, in helping B2B salespeople be more effective. So, tech salespeople, med devices salespeople, et cetera. And the other is professional services. And there we're talking about not salespeople per se, but doer sellers, right? Partners in law, accounting, consulting, investment banking, you name it, who are responsible not just for selling client business, but for delivering it as well, which is a fundamentally different commercial motion. So we've got two parts to our business, and we use kind of research-backed methods to train, advise, consult to, everyone from associates in those organizations all the way up to, leaders, CROs, managing partners, et cetera, about how to attract, retain, grow their client relationships.
So germane to the conversation today too. So as I think you know, we are focused also on professional services, and we're bringing forth a platform focused on using AI to drive customer retention, short form. And a devout follower of your research, I know you've recently published some interesting findings about how buyer behavior is changing in professional services. And I was hoping you could give us some insight on what you've concluded.
Yeah, so for listeners, Pete's being modest because Pete is one of the guys who taught me how to do research. So if you don't like any of this, actually, you can blame Pete.
Yeah, it's all my fault, all of it.
That's right. So we just completed a large global study of professional services partners. We think it's the first that's been done, actually, quantitative study. We collected data from about 1,800 partners around the world. We focused on a few key segments. Obviously, professional services is a broad sector, but we looked at partners in law, accounting, consulting, both management and strategy consulting, executive search, investment banking, and then we looked at PR and communications. Those were the segments we looked at. So we didn't have business banking or commercial real estate or engineering or design or advertising, but I think a lot of the findings can apply in there. So we'll talk a little bit more about the findings, but one of the big ones, you just alluded to, Pete, is that something has changed in the client buying environment. And I think firms and partners have felt that something was amiss now for, 5 to 10 years, that the techniques they were using to engage clients just weren't leading to the same outcomes that they once did. And when we went out and we actually spoke to a set of about 100 clients, so we're talking about C-level buyers, and we asked them a whole range of questions. Some of them engaged in in-depth interviews with us to talk about how buying has evolved, specifically around professional services. And one of the big insights that came out of this is that clients today are just a heck of a lot less loyal than they once were. We asked these clients to think about, 5 years ago when you were hiring a law firm or hiring an investment bank or hiring a consulting firm, if the firm you used in the past did good work, would you just go back to the same partners, to the same firms? Would you just go back to the well? And the vast majority of clients said yes. So it was about 78% said, yeah, we would just go back and use the same providers. Why wouldn't we? We've got a relationship. They know our business. They did good work. Why not go back to them? Today, that number is about 53%. So only about 53%, about half of the respondents said we would automatically go back. And then we asked them to think forward 5 years from now, and that number drops down to about a third. Only about a third of clients say we would automatically hire the same firms we did. Now, I think that's this undercurrent, right? That's going on in professional services. Today, clients are bidding out the work. Even if you've done good work, you might get invited to the party. You might get invited to compete for the business, but you don't automatically get the business. Clients are, procurement's involved. They're looking at alternate service providers. They're looking at boutique and niche providers. They're using alternate fee arrangements. It's just a much more competitive market than it once was. And that just has upended the entire partner go-to-market motion and a lot of the conventional wisdom out there about what drives client loyalty.
That's amazing. That's huge. It's having done research, as we've said together, you don't often find such stark conclusions that you can actually pivot off of and drive value for potential clients. And so if I'm a executive in a middle market professional services firm listening right now, what on earth do I do about that? Of course, our focus here is on AI and how the technology can be used to advance customer retention and growth. What are you seeing in that space? What's cool that's happening on the AI front?
It will become a great equalizer, enabler, I think, for every partner out there. So I'll give you an example. We interviewed the head of state and local tax at one of the biggest law firms in the world, and he said he gets up at 3 a.m. every Friday, literally every Friday. He has his whole career and reads all the state and local tax court decisions and then thinks about, who in my network would this decision have impact on, right? And who should I reach out to with an offer to engage and have a conversation? That's really manual stuff, right? But if you think of the power of a platform like a Gen AI powered platform to sort through all the news and the events, whether it's tax court decisions or it's M&A news or it's job changes or what have you, and then surface up for a partner and map it to opportunities in a partner's network to say, hey, Pete, you're a partner here. Have you thought about reaching out to Susan, who's the CFO at this firm, with this piece of insight? By the way, I pre-drafted an email. Now you just can take it and make it your own and make it sound like something from Pete. I mean, that's just phenomenal. Now, these folks who got there already, like I said, they did the manual hard work, but it's, in today's day and age, you don't really have to do that, right? You have I like to think of these AI capabilities almost like Jarvis to Iron Man, right? It's not replacing what the partner's doing, but it's this powerful, super powered, like our computer powered suit of armor that's guiding you as to where you spend your time, who you should engage, what you should look out for, and what you should engage with, and just providing this really powerful support capability.
Are you seeing any sort of AI operating on its own to anticipate customer attrition issues? Are you seeing any applications along those lines? I'm trying to go back to where we started with the changing buying behavior.
Yeah, well, so I think I know of a number of companies working on that right now, because that's obviously a big issue, and it's a blind spot for partners in professional services firms. They get blindsided by the fact that a client, they went with a competitor for a piece of business and they didn't even know the competitor was in the market for that piece of business. Yep. And some of that can be tied back to the fact that, you haven't engaged this client in several months and you haven't been proactive, and relationship decay, we all know, is a real thing. And look, you and I spent a long time at CB studying sales, right? And we know that it's hard for full-time salespeople to become really good at sales. This is a part-time job for partners in professional services, so it's even harder. They just don't get as many at-bats. They never hone their skills in the same way, and so guarding gets some of those blind spots. And you can imagine client work, you get pulled into a big matter, you get pulled into a big search, a big client engagement, a big deal. It can be all consuming. And then suddenly these other relationships, you're letting them kind of decay or atrophy.
Yes.
And suddenly they've switched to a competitor, and you read about it on LinkedIn or you hear about it at the bar. And it's such a painful moment for partners. Now, I'll say from some of our research on B2B, we have seen some interesting work there around, for example, for B2B salespeople, detecting potential no decision losses. No decision losses are like the bane of the salesperson's existence. Yep. All that time and effort going into a deal that just goes nowhere and evaporates into nothingness. So we've seen companies using data like, obviously there's latency in interactions, like, or how much a deal has been in the CRM system past the standard deviation of the sales predicted sales cycle time. I've also seen interesting things like companies looking at unstructured data like email communications, and looking at how brief those are becoming. So the briefer and the more terse they're becoming and the farther apart they're becoming might be indicative of the fact that the client's starting to disengage from the sale. We've seen companies do their own research and say, look, we found that when a salesperson goes in and reforecasts the deal size multiple times, that actually is a forward indicator of a potential no decision loss. It's pretty clear the client doesn't really know what they want, and we haven't done the due diligence and the diagnosis upfront to really set this up for success. So I could see a lot of those things being applied equally in the professional services world. And again, I know there are a lot of companies out there working on developing those capabilities to provide that kind of co-pilot and predictive support for partners.
That's our sense too, is that there's in this notion of relationship decay, there's often so much going on in a relationship that one person can't possibly stay on top of, and AI is the answer for crawling through the communication channels and the data points to make inference and point you to where problems may lie. So, Matt, it's been so great to see you, and thank you for all your thoughtful observations and insights.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks as always for listening and watching. If you haven't already, we would really love for you to leave a review, and we'd especially love a 5-star review if you don't mind us asking for one. We'd also love if you would share this episode with another executive, especially with this one, maybe an executive of another professional services organization. At the end of each episode, we always like to ask one of our favorite AI friends what they think about the episode. So today, Claude, it's your turn. This episode, we're talking about why client retention is so hard in professional services. So what do you think, and how can you help?
Client retention is difficult in professional services because the quality of the service depends heavily on the relationship between the provider and client. AI can help by analyzing data to identify at-risk clients and recommend strategies to strengthen client relationships.
And now, you're in the know. Thanks as always for listening. We'll see you next week with more headlines, roundtable discussions, and interviews with AI experts.